We're midway through COP, and we're trying to, through this series, understand not just what's happening at the Conference of the Parties in Dubai, but also what are the political and economic storylines that are preceding and will follow from this meeting. I'm joined today by two people on the ground in Dubai who have been, I'm hoping, attending a lot of events, hearing the side conversations, and can give us a picture as to what's going on as the conference proceeds. My guests today are Gracelin Baskaran, Research Director at CSIS, and Robinson Meyer, Executive Editor of Heatmap News.
That's right.
Welcome both. Now, am I right to say that you are both COP first-timers?
That is absolutely correct for me. Despite covering COPs since 2015, when the Paris Agreement was signed, and following them, I have never actually been to one.
And Gracelin?
Echoing that, it is my first time, and it has been an absolutely thrilling experience.
So maybe we can begin with kind of, this is moved from what was previously a very wonky, highly diplomatic set of intergovernmental relations to now what you might describe as the largest climate trade show every year. But it's still, that the core of it is this sense of what can countries do together to address the risks of climate change. Rob, maybe we can start with you. Sort of what is your impression now midway through of a sense of momentum and a sense that COP28 is living up to its promises or is falling into pitfalls?
I think that advocates would kind of tell you two things. The first, the big deliverable from this COP has not yet been settled, and that's the global stocktake. The global stocktake is kind of the current big part of the Paris cycle. So a few years ago, every country made a commitment to reduce its emissions. Now in the stocktake, they are looking at how they did and kind of producing a consensus document describing how the process has gone so far. It has generally not gone well. And the question is how realistic, what kind of targets will that document set? At this point, negotiators are still figuring out what's going to be in that document. And I think most advocates would tell you that whether the COP is a success or failure in their view would come down to kind of what language makes that document. But the other thing that's happened at this COP that I think has been a pleasant surprise to many people is the approval and operationalization or launching in normal human English of the Loss and Damage Fund. This is the fund that will support countries, bearing the brunt of climate change's impacts. And I've heard actually quite a lot of pleasant surprise from advocates about how well the process of launching that fund has gone. It's kind of a three-point thing. They say, frankly, they didn't expect that there would be a consensus document among the parties to the Paris Agreement about how to design that fund before we got to COP. They didn't expect that once there was a consensus document that the parties would adopt it, which they did on the first day. And they didn't expect that as soon as it was adopted, parties and countries would make commitments to that document, to that fund, which they did again on the first day, including the UAE, the United States, Japan, and the EU. And in fact, it feels like the EU now is kind of in a race. The EU member states are in a race to make larger and larger commitments. So in that way, I think the big thing from COP is kind of unresolved, but the Loss and Damage Fund has actually been a pleasant surprise to many people about how well it's gone.
Well, and one of the themes that we've looked at repeatedly in the context of this series is that this is the UAE wanted to be a bridge between the global South and the Western countries. That there's the sense that those Western countries have sort of dominated the conversation around climate abatement. And loss and damage is sort of one of the key areas where there's been historically tension between the developed world and developing world. Gracelin, you've spent much of your career working in Africa. You've focused a lot on just transition issues. What's your sense of this COP being a bridge between the developed world and the global South when it comes to climate change?
In a way, this COP feels like a notable transition in the climate discourse. And what I mean by that is that this is the time that the UAE has actually prided themselves in being the most inclusive COP summit that we've had. When you sit in various convenings, whether it is with the likes of high-level Western policymakers or emerging economies, the conversation is really shifting to how do we ensure that we don't leave behind developing countries. I thought Ajay Banga, the World Bank president, put it quite well, which is we need to use this COP to focus on reducing the distrust between developed and developing countries. And we've seen that play out in various ways. As Rob mentioned, one of the core parts of that is a loss and damage fund. Another part of that is the use of voluntary carbon markets, which basically would generate the funds needed to enable developing countries to transition. A third part is a scaled up investment from multilateral development banks. So what we're really saying now at this COP is that decarbonization is not a homogenous journey. Rather, it's a bifurcated journey in which advanced economies, in a way, have a responsibility to ensure that decarbonization is fair, it's inclusive, and I think at the very heart of that sits the fact that developing countries are saying, look, we can't do this without more finance. We don't have the economic capacity, we don't have the skills, we don't have the technical know-how. So bring us through that journey. And I think to that extent, the UAE has actually been very successful at driving a very inclusive summit.
You know, I agree. And in fact, you kind of see announcements, there's been a flurry of them about different low carbon technologies, nuclear, carbon capture, hydrogen, stuff that wonks knew was part of the climate portfolio, but didn't always get attention maybe 5 years ago. But there's also a critique that this has been way too inclusive, right? That there, in advance of the conference, there was a sense that even hosting a COP in a small petrostate, having Sultan Al Jaber as the COP president, was kind of like letting the fox in the hen house. Rob, what's your sense of what governments are thinking and how external observers are seeing the role of the UAE in midway through the thing?
Yeah, well, I think the key event, you know, in this COP probably happened just before it started, where there was the release of documents that, you know, appear to show that Sultan Al Jaber, the COP president, who, just for people who don't know, kind of plays a greater than ceremonial role in the COP work. So kind of the DJ of COP and winds up being the person who single-handedly or allegedly single-handedly is supposed to bring deals together and make things happen. That in the kind of course of his world travels before the COP started, when he talked to all these stakeholders, he was also, the documents show, making oil deals himself for ADNOC, the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, which he leads. I think that probably, I saw a former COP president refer to it as a Volkswagen moment. You know, that this actor who seemed to be doing the right thing actually was maybe not doing the right thing the entire time. I think lots of people were already kind of skeptical, and I think that really colored the COP coming in. You know, of course, Sultan Al Jaber says that he is he denies those claims. He says that he is following the science. There's been another dust up where different comments surfaced from him about the 1.5C goal and whether to phase out or phase down fossil fuels, which is itself a kind of contentious phrase in the global Stocktake negotiations.
Yeah, and that's one of the big sticking points, right? Is the
exactly
kind of language around the role of fossil fuels amidst energy transition and unabated versus full phase out. I mean, this is like where COP conversations have historically been, right? Nitpicking over words. Is that a distraction? Like, is there a bunch of stuff that's good that's happening that, is just sort of like the way that the negotiators end up deciding this is maybe less significant than a lot of the activity on the ground or progress that's being made?
I think that's right. I got to ask Bill Gates a few days ago what he thought the point of COP was. And he said basically, the point of COP at this point, of course, is to have this message this week devoted to climate change and the urgency of that kind of getting out to the rest of the other 7 billion people, as he put it. And the second thing is that there are many companies and many firms and universities trying to develop the kind of technology that we'll need to actually decarbonize not just the power sector and the transportation sector, but the whole rest of the economy. And those companies are here. They're talking to countries. They're announcing deals. They're talking to investors. And he thought that that was the most important part of COP. I think broadly what we've seen is that there's COP is the moment when companies and countries are supposed to announce things about climate change, and that CEOs really do get together and say, hey, let's announce something for COP, your company and my company. And that over time, that actually does wind up being a driver of change and wind up being a driver of momentum. And so to some degree, the fact that every COP is now a mega COP is kind of the point, that every COP has these negotiations at the center, but is so much more, is kind of the point of COP at this point, I think.
Gracelin, you're there on the ground for CSIS, you're attending meetings, you've been on panels, kind of what's one thing that you take away from the first week that betrayed your expectations or surprised you?
I'm not a climate Grinch. It's close to Christmas, but I'm not a climate Grinch. But I wanna say this, is that the whole let's phase out fossil fuels doesn't work. When I sit in conversations in these private roundtables with the private sector, with governments, both from kind of North America, Europe, and Africa, my biggest takeaway is that energy justice is at the center of this. I mentioned earlier that it's a bifurcated road that we're looking at with this COP. We're not looking at a homogeneous decarbonization journey. And in that is the phase out of fossil fuels is actually not attainable in the global south. When I look at the fact, we've talked a lot about this at CSIS, it's something we're doing a lot of work on, is 590 million Africans don't have access to energy at all. And another billion people are gonna come into existence in the next 25 years. Africa has 2.4% of renewable energy investment. I sat in an event this morning with an industry association, a North American one. And the reality is that the development of bankable projects means that it doesn't take me 6 months to develop a project. So it's years. And at the point that we're at, we are not able to deploy the private capital to do the energy transition. And we're also not getting, the public finance isn't available, the development banks aren't bridging the gap. So we're kind of at this point, at this COP of saying, okay, what is the lowest emissions possible route to getting to universal energy access? So that would be my first point, I think, is that the phase out that we came in and talked about, that a lot of European Union policymakers were in favor of, it just doesn't work for developing countries where a lot of our population and energy poverty sits.
Rob,
I think this.
Sorry to interrupt. Go ahead and complete. Yeah.
No, I realize it's a little bit of a hot take, but it is, I think, a consensus that nobody can disagree that if I say I'm phasing out, it's not a form of energy injustice in a way that would cripple developing countries. I think I would say that the second point to that is when I look at decarbonization, a huge conversation is this just energy transition, right? What is just? And again, in these roundtables, it's saying there's two dimensions to a just energy transition. One is the energy transition, and the other is the economic development just component. And we understand that decarbonization, we understand emissions reductions, but we have a lot of progress to make to say, how do we ensure that the transition is just, that the communities and the workers who are at the heart of this are not left behind. I really like something John Kerry said the other day, is that our biggest challenge in this journey is not actually whether we can reach net zero. He says, I know we can reach net zero. He said, but can we do it fast enough and in a way that's inclusive enough? And that is the question I think that this COP is grappling in many ways.
Rob, actually, thank you, Gracelin. Rob, I think, one of the things we are going to look at from the U.S. side of things, Biden administration, while the president didn't attend, has sent a long list of very senior officials.
Oodles of people, yes.
And I think they really want to emphasize the reassert the role of the U.S. as a global leader on climate, on technology innovation. Is that resonating with the broader community at COP? How do you feel that the U.S. efforts are being received?
It's an interesting question. I think that the perception of the U.S. as being newly at the table, the perception of the U.S. as having the Inflation Reduction Act as being a major player here in a way that it was not 3 years ago, persists. That I think that kind of happened soon after the Inflation Reduction Act passed. There was a period of time where people realized how big it was, and that has held on. I think that I think that, frankly, the world's understanding of this, from talking to other parties, talking to other people, the world's understanding of this probably mirrors our understanding here in the United States, where they understand that the Biden administration and the Democratic Party, and maybe even some aspects of the Republican Party, especially in the Senate, are more committed to these things and are more interested in them, and that a future Trump administration would not be, and that there's a lot of questions about how politically durable this stuff is, pushing into 2025. And I think the understanding that the U.S. is extremely powerful and can do a lot on this stuff, and is doing a lot right now, but is also can be quite an unreliable partner. I think that is generally how other actors understand the U.S. actions here. I do unfortunately have to run at this point to make another COP event, a late night COP event, but I want to thank you so much for having me and for having this discussion.
Hey, we're very grateful that you joined us. Thank you so much, Rob, and safe travels home.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Gracelin, maybe we can close, but I'm really interested in hearing just any final thoughts from you on what folks should look for in the closing half of COP, right? Are there outcomes apart from an agreement around the stocktake and questions of phasing down, phasing out unabated fossil fuels? What are the now that you've been there, what are the things you are going to look at a week from now and are still a little bit of a mystery today?
There's many things that are a mystery, and I think if they weren't, we wouldn't be in the midst of a 70,000 plus people gathering for the biggest crisis that we face. So I would say there's a few things that jump out. There's a lot of debate still around, like, do we phase out? Do we phase down? And I'm really intrigued to see how that actually plays out going forward. I would say that there is when we came in, there was a bigger global north push to say we're phasing out. But I think this COP has brought to light the challenges around energy justice. When we sat in this discussion with John Kerry and a range of other senior level policymakers on voluntary carbon credits, what I found really interesting was the likes of Nigeria had joined. These are countries that have not historically been a part of conversations of how do we finance the transition. So this COP has brought together those stakeholders. So I'm really intrigued to see how the UAE continues to bridge the gap between global north and global south, and how that will drive the decision ultimately phase down versus phase out. My initial, and I'm happy to be wrong because I'm wrong often, is that the phase out that we arrived at COP with, kind of like we're pushing away towards elimination, may give out to like a let's kind of phase down. I guess that would be one thing. The second thing is the loss and damage fund. Look, loss and damages have been a hot and heavy topic. When we talk about climate mitigation, it's potentially commercially lucrative, right? We're talking about renewable energy. We're talking about electric vehicles. We're talking about these things that have a commercial return. Adaptation has very little commercial return. It's often a public good. It's financed by governments. It's financed by the public sector. So in that regard, I'm really interested to see is what does the loss and damage fund look like in implementation? Mm-hmm. Because a one-time capitalization of saying, you know what, I'm going to put in $100 billion is not a sustainable financing mechanism, because that $100 billion is going to exhaust very quickly in the context of increasing frequency and severity of shocks. A couple of cyclones, you'll be out of that money. So what is the recapitalization measure to make it sustainable over like a, hey, one time we've all put in this pot of money? That'd be the second thing. And I think the third thing that I'm really interested in looking at is, look, the UAE was always a controversial holder of COP. I mean, it is a fossil fuel hub. And there's two elements to that. So one is that, I've sat in the events with oil companies and gas companies just as much as I've sat with the climate NGOs. And oil and gas companies are here to stay. They're making commitments to things like methane reduction. But at the same time, their business model is certainly giving shape now to the extent that the shift in consumption is currently ongoing. It will be less EU and US, and it will be more Latin America, it will be more Africa.
Right.
So how they make those commitments to reducing their emissions will be of great interest. And I think when I take this together, I would say that this is a very formative COP, because I said earlier, it focuses on inclusivity and a bifurcated track to decarbonization. And I think at the end of the day, what we have to see is that decarbonization is not going to look the same for everybody. And with a lot of political uncertainty in the horizon in the US and the UK, you know, in other parts of the world in terms of administrations, it's going to say, can we develop a consensus in a way that's actually not going to be politically upended by future administrations? I'm really excited to see that play out, and I'm hopeful that we can meet our decarbonization goals in a way that's not at odds with energy justice.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining me today for this program. Best of luck for the remainder of the trip, and we look forward to seeing you back in Washington soon.
Thanks, Joseph.